work we've been doing since 2009 in Alaska, and introduce you to some of our partners in Alaska, as well as give you an idea of the kinds of things that we can find in frozen sites across the Arctic that are now thawing out. This is the Yupik culture area in the circle there, and it's part of the Eskimo-speaking world. In Yupik country, they don't mind being called Eskimos. From North Alaska on to Greenland, they prefer to be called Inuit, but they're very closely related genetically and culturally. In fact, most of the people who spoke an Eskimo language or speak an Eskimo language are actually lived in southwestern Alaska, where there was an abundant resources there, and the climate was a little easier to deal with than in the high Arctic. Our stereotype of the Inuit Eskimo culture comes from first encounters in the Eastern Arctic. So we have this idea of people that with the big fur parkas that are out in the ice, and that certainly holds true for some people in the Eastern Arctic, but relatively small numbers compared to the people in Southwest Alaska, especially centered around Yupik country and the North Pacific. This circle shows Queenahawk, which is one of the villages in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta area of Alaska. And this is a pretty big area. This is about the size of Great Britain. And there has been an archaeological project there looking at Yupik prehistory since 1977, and that was a 1 by 8 meter trench. So it's almost an entirely unknown archaeological record as far as the Yupik culture there. Queenahawk is kind of on the south side of the Yupik culture area, and is one of about 65 villages there. It's a picture of the village from the air using a drone. I spent, when I was there in the fall before COVID hit and kind of got stuck out there during the lockdown. I was there for the better part of a year, which was really great, seeing it during the winter when it looks very different, when it's just this frozen sheet of ice going way out to the Bering Sea. As you can see, it's a very low topography, and they're pretty close to the water. Queenahawk still is very subsistence oriented, and although a lot of the material culture has changed, they're using vehicles and skiffs now to hunt. The basic subsistence lifestyle still exists, and the layout of households there is very much the same, with the gear and the products of subsistence life still around. They're very much dependent on fish, caribou, and so on. A lot of their seasonal round depends on subsistence. It's the way they organize their culture. It's the way they organize their time. And you can't overstate the importance of subsistence in today's Yupik villages. Even though there are market foods available, they're very expensive. So Queenahawk, like other villages, like much of the North, is being really hammered by culture change. And one of the larger scale effects of that is the melting of the permafrost. As that permafrost melts, it exposes soils that have the consistency of bread flour, and erosion impacts those coastlines to the degree that parts of Alaska have lost more than a mile of shoreline, and with it, that entire archaeological and fossil record. And it's not just erosion. The scary bit is that although the erosion is severe, as that permafrost melts, all these beautifully preserved organic artifacts and fossils, like the mammoths in Siberia, are rotting in the ground. Not only rotting, but producing methane that makes, climate change even worse. So it's a race to record these sites. There's a lot of coastline out there. And right now we're one of two archaeological projects that are focused on saving what we can of collapsing archaeological sites. It's been a long time since people have worked in the Yupik area, and even those were small excavations because people were resistant to that. It's a very difficult place to access and expensive to get to, and people have an affinity for the products of their ancestors to the extent where they're almost sacred sites. People feel that not all objects, but some objects have a kind of personhood, and they don't like the idea of people coming in and taking objects used by their ancestors and taking them away. And they have heirloom status, like this heirloom being held by Emma here. And so it took a while. As the site was being washed away, they were finding artifacts on the beach. And so it took some convincing. It's a lot of meetings between some of the people who wanted the project and some of who didn't. But in the end, they decided that they wanted to save these pieces. And they had two primary goals. One is to save the artifacts, and the other one is to better reconnect their young people to their traditional culture. And so, after about a year or two of intense discussions, that that finally won out. Is making that connection. So we set up a joint project with the village, and they provide the logistics, the local transportation, the local knowledge. They do things like build our screens and so on. And without that support, we never would have been able to pull this off, even with the generous grants we got. And at the university, we provide the scientific expertise in excavation and processing and in doing the conservation on the objects. So as time has gone on, this cooperative relationship has grown. And what really makes it work is the engagement with the local community. We're not there to study them. They are our colleagues. And together we're puzzling out the past. And that's what makes it so much fun for everyone, because they get to share in the joy of discovery, and we get to, access their huge knowledge about the place and about the environment and even the objects, a lot of which they grew up with. And so we've got a very multicultural, multivocal approach to archaeology, kind of combining the best of Western and indigenous ways of knowing. This is the site, and to find it, we follow a trail of artifacts on the high tide line. You can see the village way in the background by that little tower there. It's 3 or 4 miles away, and we use the beach as a highway. Use four-wheelers to access the site, and it's being washed away at a pretty good clip. Since we started in 2009, we've lost about 45 feet, or about 15 meters of that shoreline. And with it, that record, our excavations blocks from 2009, 2010 are already overboard. So this is our block. We have to open a lot of squares because we're working on excavating an entire house, and we're working as fast as we can, barely staying ahead of the erosion. And of course, we get a lot of participation from the village. Everybody comes out to see the latest finds and stops by to help in all sorts of different ways. And when there's a spectacular piece, we spread the word so people can come out, especially when there's a mask, that's maybe face down in the ground. We have people come out so they can see the reveal, so we can kind of all share in that. What we're digging in are the remains of a sod house. And normally in Yupik villages, there was a large men's house and a lot of smaller houses that families lived in. The house we encountered, though, was of a much larger scale and had a lot of smaller rooms in it. And it turns out that was an adaptation to a period of time called the Bow and Arrow Wars. It was during the middle of the Little Ice Age. Resources may have been scarce, hunting territories may have been under pressure. And local warfare exploded. So they kind of built this large sod house as a way of protecting themselves from attack, and also as a way of sharing food and fuel resources. And so we didn't really expect that. We'd heard a story. There's a famous story about an attack on a village in this area, but we had no idea when we started that this, in fact, was that village. And when we started, we found this burned layer on top, and it was absolutely riddled with slate end blades from an attack where they burned down the house and smoked the people out of the side rooms. We found the remains of pottery, and some of this pottery was filled with seal oil and used as an accelerant to start the fires by the attackers who were from another village up the Kuskokwim River. So we found this scorched house floor with all these objects on it that were left from that day of the attack, which took place sometime around 1670 or so. We burned basketry, burned wooden bowls, a doll. We found that knife blade right under the remains of that burnt vessel on the plank house floor. So, and the dogs died inside the house. I don't know if they were tied up or they were just, hiding from people or whatever, but we found the bodies of the dogs very well preserved, sometimes with the meat still on the bones in places where they were still frozen. This one had been burned, a beam fell on it, a burning beam, and it preserved the meat to the extent where you can see all the muscle tissue, you can see the outline of the tail and the fur and everything. When I saw that, I thought, oh my God, what's going to happen when we find the people? Are they going to look like this? And archaeologists have this reputation as, grave robbers anyway, especially among indigenous people in Alaska. And so I was kind of, dreading finding someone, laid out like this, kind of the consistency of beef jerky. But in fact, we did find human remains, but they had been taken in the back. I think they had been smoked out of the house, and we found them tied with grass rope, and they'd been killed. We found some with the blade still stuck in their neck. Some had been beheaded, and in short, the remains exactly matched the story that had been passed down, an oral history that was very precise, even though it was, the better part of 400 years old. So the bow and arrow wars were well known from oral history, but this is the first archaeological evidence we'd ever found. All that was known as far as the chronology was that this had happened before the Russians arrived in the 1820s. But now we had an actual archaeological example, a very rare example of warfare between indigenous peoples. And so beneath that level, we started finding, the rest of their history on the site. They lived there for about 150 years. And because it's been in permafrost all this time and just thawed out, about 80% of what we find are things made of wood and grass and leather. This is what all archaeological sites used to look like. But now, all we get out of the stones and bones. But the preservation here was spectacular. So we get the split driftwood floorboards of hallways and side rooms, as well as, bentwood vessels and their hafted tools and artwork. And so a tremendous amount of material comes up when you get everything. And not to mention the things like, hair and clumps of dog hair and human hair and everything you could think of, all these organics preserved on these house floors. And the deeper we got, the better the preservation was. And you can see, you're making decisions as an archaeologist about what to save and what to map and what to sample. But it's kind of daunting looking at these, these house floors, and we had to dig through them. By all rights, we should just cut them up in big 1 meter blocks and take them apart in the lab. But there wasn't any way to do that. So we just did the best we could with sampling and mapping. We have a whole row of refrigerators full of bulk samples of these house floors that are full of things like seeds and feathers and berries and leaves. And some of the grass is green grass that dates from the mid 1600s. And we'd find it to be all green like this, and it would fade as the oxygen hit it and turn brown right in front of your eyes. Sometimes we'd get a house floor that was covered with sawdust and little wood chips and still bright colored like fresh cut wood. And then it would kind of brown up. It takes about 20 minutes and the color fades right in front of you. So this is the kind of thing that's rotting away right now all over the Arctic as the permafrost melts. You get these woven grass mats on the floors and basketry. Who finds grass baskets? We had to go through the conservation manuals a long time before we found anybody that, finds grass. They find it, in Egyptian tombs and in desert caves and things, but it's pretty rare. Not just the roots, but the grass blades. So we get, a couple thousand pieces of basketry and cordage of all different sizes, fantastically complicated and difficult to get out of the ground because it's all soft, and then get it back to the lab in Aberdeen and conserve it and then send it back to Aberdeen. So all these pieces went through that. We'd find them, recover them, and conserve them mostly by just drying them out. But the cleaning process, getting all the dirt from all those little, all that detailed surface is tough. But we found that they're very much like the baskets that are being used today. And so we use the Yupik terminology for the baskets. And some of the weaves have been unknown to people. They've been lost and now are being taught again. And have kind of become part of the modern repertoire of basket makers once again after centuries. We find a lot of pieces of scraps of clothing from sealskin, boots still filled with the grass liners, bits of clothing, and these little triangular pieces that we couldn't figure out for a long time. We thought maybe they were decorative, but the skin sewers showed us that when you have a hide that you need that isn't quite symmetrical enough for clothing, that you can kind of fill that out and stretch it by putting in these little triangles. And so that's what those were. It's one example of a lot of things that local craftspeople and tradition bearers helped us understand. A lot of bentwood bowls. These are made by taking a piece of driftwood and smoothing out a big plank and then steaming it and bending it around to make the rim around the base. Incredibly fine work. And a lot of times painted with the red ochre. And that ochre serves the same purpose as the kinds of red color on a barn. It helps defeat decomposition as well as being colorful. But the red ochre is functional as well as decorative. And now we're doing some studies on the sources of some of the pigments that we find on the pieces. Pottery, very common, both lamps and bowls, cups even, fairly small. A lot of them look like they were used for processing sea mammal fat, for rendering the fat into oils on a fire and just cooking. The clay lamps are unfired, just gray clay held together by dog fur, as it turns out. I'm not sure why that is, if it's ideological or just the easiest fur to find, or why they didn't fire their lamps. Most cultures did, but they were unfired gray clay. So as we excavated, people obviously recognize some of these things from when they were kids, and people still use ulaks, these women's knives for cutting fish, although now they have metal blades. But people would bring their grandchildren. And so very quickly that link between the past and the newer generations formed. And you've got a lot of conversations going on that hadn't gone on for a long time between elders and their kids. Hunting gear, abundant, especially things related to archery. Those are all arrow nocks from wooden arrows. And you can see the lashing shadow. We don't get sinew. Sinew rots away, but you get the shadow from it. So you can see where the feathers were fletched onto the arrows, snow goggles, little visors that tie to your forehead, like a modern baseball hat, point sheaths out of wood, some still tied together. And these were made for both the arrows and the harpoons to keep those sharp points from putting holes in clothing or kayak decks. Bows, wooden bows, and their little tools. So, you know, pretty amazing set of gear. And in a normal site, that we usually excavate, all we get is that slate end blade. So the amount of information contained in one of these preserved sites is so huge and so worthwhile that I'm thinking it's really a waste of time to dig in a site without preservation. It's worth spending extra time until you get it. Now, not every place has this, but you'd be surprised, even in the UK, where you get enough fresh water saturating soil, the preservation. And there's some examples of those. The thing that's about Yupik and Inuit material culture in general is that it's quite complex, and they have a lot of gadgets. And part of it's because the gear you need for hunting sea mammals is so complex. So just a drawing of a schematic of a harpoon, you can see all of the little bits and pieces that go together just to go out and catch a seal. And that took thousands of years to develop that technology. And so when it falls apart, and when the parts are scattered around, pretty tough to decode this. But we're lucky in the Arctic in that these lifeways survived into living memory, and that there are elders who can tell us what these things are and what they were used for. If we had to start from scratch and just figure out what these things were, it'd be tough. So we spent a lot of time not just talking to elders, but also talking to or looking at ethnographic collections. There's two kinds of harpoon points, for example, one used from a kayak, the barbed ones, and the toggling harpoon points, which are used more from the ice or from a larger boat. John Hunter, his real name, actually recreated some of the points from the site in metal. And they worked so well, he went out the first year with these harpoons and got 4 seals right away. And the big advantage of these is that it attaches the seal to your boat. When you shoot at them with a rifle and even hitting them in the head, the seal oftentimes sinks because, and you've got to get to it right away. And with the distances they're using from a rifle, oftentimes they'll lose a seal that's been shot. But with a harpoon, you get all of them. And so more and more people are turning to these, and now they're selling them in the hardware store. These are fish lures out of ivory and antler, and those little holes were full of pyrites or sometimes red ochre, and you can see a little of that in some of those that were used to attract fish. And these are used for jigging through the ice. When a lot of field work goes on during the summer, we have this image of people scooping up salmon and during the summer, but I can tell you after being out there for winter that as much fishing goes on during the winter as it does the rest of the year. And so these little lures are used to bring fish up close to the top where they can be speared. Very similar lures used now. Same way with net gauges and net shuttles used for making fish nets. People recognize these and showed us how they were used. Kayak parts, abundant in the site, oftentimes painted with red ochre to prevent decay and also to signal their function as a hunting tool. And we found all the parts known in ethnographic kayaks, and all of these had a name in Yupik. And they even had a song that you sang, a special song as you made his parts. And these were all made of driftwood. And the bow pieces are made of stumps, where the root attaches to the stump and has that natural curvature that matches the function of the piece. So they would go a long way to find the right piece of wood on the beach to match the function of the kayak frame. And we found, enough probably to make several kayaks. And there were miniature kayaks, so we can see what the larger ones looked like. A little different than the ethnographically known ones, a little thinner and a faster boat than the ones they used in historic times. And, the kids in the village tried out these little models and a little model boatmen that plug into them. And what they ended up learning, which is interesting, is how to balance a boat so it would stay upright in the water. A lot of gaming and gambling gear and the house floors, dice pieces made of ivory and bone, a lot of tops that were spun, and you would make a bet on how long it could spin, and a lot of darts. You can see they have bone points, but the tapered ends fit into the shaft of a feather, and kind of like a modern pub dart. And things like that this kayak bow were found next to a dart, and these are, you can see the little holes in it that was used for a target. We found story knives, and these are still used, although nowadays they'll more likely use a knife from the silverware drawer. But these originally were carved by fathers for their daughters, and they would tell stories by drawing pictures in the mud. And these pictographs, the original pictographs, must be very old, and it's almost like a hieroglyph, almost like an alphabet. And we found a symbol for woman, for example, on an ivory tattoo needle. So they were very close to developing kind of a hieroglyphic alphabet. A lot of ivory, carved, mostly walrus ivory, but also fossil ivory from mammoth tusks, still being carved today. John Smith is an ivory carver, and he would come out to the site and take a look at the latest pieces. And he said there were some pieces that he couldn't create today, even using a Dremel, that these took a long time to make, especially with stone tools. But what he would do is when we found a nice ivory piece, he would recreate that. And so it became a thing for us on the crew, if we found a nice ivory piece, to have John make us a copy that we would wear around our necks. And so by the end of the field season, we're all draped in ivory carvings from John's work. A lot of small carvings used as charms and so on, amulets in wood of animals and birds. The one with all the spikes on top is like a little porcupine. It has 4 little legs underneath. A lot of seals, but also beluga and so on. Lots of these, and birds, especially. Birds had a special place in the Yupik belief system because they transcended boundaries. They could go in the sky, through the clouds, they could dive underwater, and even lived underground sometimes. And so they were kind of sacred animals. When you were out on the water, you had a spirit protector who was a bird. And so some of the species can actually be recognized in these little model birds, ptarmigan, owls, and so on, especially owls, because owls, according to the Yupik, speak Yupik and deliver messages. And they're very magical because in the Yupik area where there's not many trees, they live underground and they pop up when you walk near them. They seem to come out of nowhere. And so a lot of representations of owls in masks and in carvings. Librettes, or lip plugs, piercings, were worn, and on a pretty large scale. And you can imagine, the infections and things, and just having a hole that big in your face. So they're paying a heavy price, but the social signaling must have been worth it. So we find a lot of large librettes, and that's related to status. And we've underestimated the role or the complexity of pre-contact Yupik culture, because they were very stratified. We know from oral histories that they had slaves, they were rich and poor people, and we found a lot of that social signaling going on inside of the sod house, where these librettes that look a lot like seals were just found in certain areas of the house, the higher status part of the house. And we know from isotope analysis that the people in that room ate a little bit better than people in other rooms of the house. These are earrings made of fossil ivory as well as walrus ivory. And there's a little hook in the back that fits through a hole in your ear. And the little loop, there's a little hole at the bottom of these, holds a little, like a little bangle, another little bead. Well, we found these in pairs sometimes. There's two themes. One is that some of them look like scoops or kitchen tools, but others have these concentric circles. And you'll notice that there's little wooden plugs in the middle of some of those that can be taken out. And the reason for that is that those concentric circles that archaeologists for years have called circle and dot motif are in fact the eye of awareness. That's the universe looking at you, and those concentric circles represent layers in that universe, the layered Yupik universe with the sky and the clouds and the ground and the water, and beneath those things, rocks on the surface were a membrane between these worlds. And so the universe is aware, it's alive, and there's a person in the universe. The earring on the right with the circles in the eye and the little holes, all those little holes are full of bright pyrites, so that sparkled in the light. And so their belief system was very much part of the material culture and expressing that material culture and worn on their bodies. And the little plugs, you can take out the little plug in the middle of the earring if you want a direct connection to the universe. There are dolls. We found a little few over 400 of these. Some represent spirit beings, some represent humans, some are just playthings for kids, some represent people that need to attend an important ceremony, but they couldn't, so a portrait was carved. So, if there's a meeting you didn't want to go to, you just, send your doll. Great. And there's some of these portraits of individuals, and some of these are probably portraits of the people who actually lived in the village. And you can see they're identified sometimes by the librettes, the inserts in their mouth and below their lip. These are a class of dolls. We call them stick dolls. We have no idea what the name is. These are unique to this site. They don't show up in ethnographic collections. No one quite remembers anything about these, but they're made on kayak stringers, the long pieces that the ribs attach to in the kayak. And they often have faces on both sides, a happy face and a sad face. We think they might be a game, but not sure. But we have several hundred of these, and very simply made, but emotive. We find large dolls as well, and these were kind of oracles for a household. And these were about 1 meter high. We found the head from one of those with the paint still on it, and you can see that the lines of the face point upwards. That means that this spirit being or person had the power to see upwards through the heavens, through the clouds, into space. If the lines point down, it's someone with the ability to see under the ground and under the sea. Something we know from the elders. And we also found masks, miniature masks that weren't quite big enough for a human, but actually fit these dolls. And so smaller masks were made to fit dolls. We know from Russian accounts that the dolls joined in ceremonies with the humans. This is Drew Michael, the Yupik mask carver. And every year we have a Yupik artist carver or a dancer or someone join the crew just to kind of round out our knowledge. These are some of the smaller masks found at the site representing spirits and animals. some with the original pigment still on those. And the larger masks, the full-size masks, were often found broken in half. And that was known as putting away the masks. And so most of the full-size masks we found were broken in half or in a garbage pile someplace. We were able to reconstruct some of them. But there are some what we found in one piece, mostly in trash piles, sometimes down in house posts and so on. So we found about a dozen full-sized wooden masks, often with the paint still on, some with librets inserted. The one with the tusks down in the lower row, the Walrus Man, is a story about a person who could transform into a walrus back and forth, and special spirit beings could bridge that gap between the animal and the human world. And so, and the lives of animals were very much part of the Yupik social world. And so this is expressed in these masks that have both human and animal attributes. The hair on the chin of the walrus mask, half of it was human hair and half of it was sea mammal hair. And the one on the upper right of a caribou had a lower jaw that could move. And so the dancer could make it talk. So these masks were very complex and had hoops representing those layers of the universe and mask attachments that would move, showing that universe in motion. And these were collected a lot by ethnographic collectors at a time when dancing was being discouraged by missionaries, and a lot ended up in museum collections. And we know now that this is quite an old tradition. The Yupik belief system also included a belief in the Yua, a spirit that could live in animals and in humans, kind of like a soul, but it could be in objects, it could be in plants, and once in a while it peeks out. You can see it peek out in the mouth or the eye or in the fur of an animal. And so this is represented in the objects that we're digging. So when the Yupik talk about objects being special, they're talking about objects that are alive, that are ensouled. And so a lot of times we'll find little faces carved in objects and in dolls. The Yua inside of a doll is represented by eyes and a little mouth on the doll, and little faces on spoons and even arrow shafts and on handles. Not all of them, but some. And so you never know when you're washing an artifact or finding one where a little face will come peeking out at you. There were also dolls and materials used by shamans, and these definitely look kind of a scary look to them. And shaman equipment, and people kind of have they're interested in the mask and the artifacts, but are still a little bit afraid of shamanic power. And a lot of people won't touch these things in the village, or when we bring them in to show them, they'll look at it sort of like if you had a rattlesnake in a cage. It's really interesting, but you don't want to get too close to it either. Shamans had helpers with little pointed heads, and it's a very ancient tradition in the northern world. And the word for these little shamans helpers is very similar in Yupik as it is in Siberia. And indeed, the little pointed headed figures are related to gnomes and elves in Northern Europe. So it's a very old belief system that transcends a lot of geographic and cultural boundaries. We find little dolls and sometimes hats, ceremonial hats worn by people in ethnographic times symbolize that extra power in the top of your head. And you wonder if bishops' hats don't kind of descend from that same ancient belief system. So a lot of artwork's very simple, but you can tell right away what you're looking at. When you're out in the water and a seal comes up next to you, it takes a big breath and its nostril opens up before it dives in the water, and this little piece of wood shows one of those seals. And that helped us decode some of what we were seeing in librettes, for example. A lot of this wood carving was done with tools made from animal teeth embedded in antler and wooden handles. A lot of rodent teeth, for example, beaver teeth, muskrat teeth. And we found these little smile-shaped dents in the tool handles. And we thought maybe they're ownership marks, but they seemed so large. But it turns out that they're carrying places for extra bits, just like in a box cutter where you have an extra bit embedded in that handle. And you can see the tool marks from on the back of the mask that show those teeth marks. They also use drills made from jade. There's a mountain in North Alaska that's about 800 coastal miles at least from Nunalik, where this jade comes from, and it's being traded all the way across the Arctic. And we made a few tools out of scrap pieces that we bought in rock shops, and it's very good. It's very sharp and beautiful, gem quality jade used in these little drill bits, still intact. So every year, at the end of the year, we show our best finds to the community and share ideas about it and have a big workshop there. Because until 2017, we were sending these all back to Aberdeen, but we wanted people to have a look at what we'd find. And so we, package everything up. There we are sitting on coolers packed full of a year's worth of finds. And we'd every day find an average of a couple of these and take them down to the lab. And they all got shipped to Aberdeen for conservation. So you've got so far about 100,000 pieces in 8 big of the larger field seasons. And those have become part of people's lives. They've invested as much labor and blood, sweat, and tears in getting the stuff out of the ground as we have. And when it came time to look for a repository for these things, the normal thing to do is to send them off to a museum, and the nearest museum would be in Fairbanks, about 700 miles from where these people live, and you might as well send it to the moon. They'll never see it again. So when it came time to figure that out, we decided that it had to stay in Quinhagak. So they got a preschool was being abandoned by the local school there, and so they moved that. And we created the Denali Culture and Archaeology Center. That's its formal name. They just call it the museum in Quinhagak. But inside is where we now process the incoming pieces and do all the conservation right there in the village. And boy, it comes in big bundles, and we spend the whole year processing this stuff before going out there again. But it's the way we've got to do it because of the erosion and the gradual disintegration of the pieces once the permafrost melts. But it's also become a genuine community center. And the kids who grew up with the project, because it's been about 12 years now, went to their elders and asked if they could form a dance group. And dancing had been forbidden there a long time ago. And no dancing had been going on because they have a very conservative Protestant religion. Missionaries came in. And so this is the first dancing that has gone on in more than a century. And they did that. They had a dance to honor the artifacts when they came home, like welcoming home as if they were people, and went out to the site and wrote a song about the artifacts and did that. And UPIC can now use the Culture Center as a place to do this. And this is all driven by them. And it's become the cool thing to do if you're a kid in Quinhagak to do this. There's no adult supervision here. This isn't set up by anybody. This is all driven just by them. So that community goal of linking young people to their culture is worked better than any of us ever imagined. So now we've got the Culture Center there, and on opening day, the elders came in and could finally see the collections all in one place. And it was a pretty amazing moment. And the dancers started working in the culture center, there's a room that's a collections room, and then there's a general purpose kind of a lab room where they do the dancing when we do the conservation. And I heard him singing one time in the collections room, and after a rehearsal, and I went in there, and they had the drawers open with the dolls, and were singing to them, and they sang to all the dolls and all the masks, because they wanted them to be part of it, because these things were alive, and they said by including them that they were no longer afraid of these pieces. And so now we're using it not only for the conservation, for dancing, but also for classes. This is a class sponsored by the Smithsonian, who did the recording of basket weaving. And so we took some of these models from the site, along with some of the elder women who still wove baskets, and taught the younger women how to weave. And so in many ways, this has kind of taken the place of the old community centers. And so it's pretty cool to watch the archaeological record become part of the cultural landscape once again. And so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.